At my son's engagement party, his fiancée stepped in front of my wife, sneered and shouted, "Do you really think that cheap old dress makes you worthy of standing beside my family?" Then she yanked the fabric, tearing it open before more than 300 guests. The ballroom fell silent, but when a long scar appeared across my wife's body, the billionaire father of the bride turned pale and dropped his glass. "No, it can't be. Is that really you?" He stammered. Within seconds, their glamorous celebration became their family's worst nightmare. The name is Dale Corbin, 63 years old, and for 38 years I have clocked in and out of the same factory floor in Indianapolis, Indiana. The same building, the same shift, the same work that built everything I have and everything I am. That is where my story begins. Welcome to Honor Revenge Stories, where the stories that stay with you long after the final word are the ones we bring to you here. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, tap subscribe so the next story finds its way to you without you having to go looking. Before we begin, I'd love to know which person in this story are you already pulling for and why. Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. A note before we go further, this story contains dramatized elements added for the purpose of telling it fully, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is coincidental. It is the truth inside the story that matters. In all those years, I never once put on a suit to go to work, but the night my son's engagement party came apart, I was wearing my best shirt, my only blazer, and a secret tucked into my inside pocket that felt heavier than anything I had ever hauled off that factory floor. Garrett met us outside the Allerton Hall. He had on a watch that probably cost more than my truck payment. He looked me over head to toe and said, "Please don't embarrass me tonight, Dad. These are important people." I looked my son straight in the eye. "I'll be exactly who I am, Garrett." Like always, he didn't care for that answer. He turned and walked through the front doors ahead of us, leaving me and Bet standing on the sidewalk like two people who had wandered up to the wrong address. Bet squeezed my hand. "Don't let him get to you," she said quietly. "He doesn't," I told her, and I meant it because I had larger things weighing on me than Garrett's nerves. The moment we stepped through those doors, I spotted it right there on the backdrop behind the welcome table. A silver logo, clean and sharp, Langley Development. The same logo I had come across on a surveying document 3 months before. The one Hank Waverly's grandson had carried to my front porch. The one with Garrett's name buried deep in the fine print. My chest tightened like a bolt cranked one turn past where it should stop. I reached into my inside pocket and pressed the small recording device on. Indiana law allows one party to a conversation to record without the other's knowledge. Tonight I was going to be that one party. Bet leaned close. "Dale, you're holding my hand too tight." "Sorry, Bet." I loosened my grip. "You look beautiful tonight." She smiled and patted my arm. She had no idea what I was carrying in that pocket. She had no idea about a good many things, and I intended to keep shouldering that weight for as long as it took. The ballroom was everything I had expected. Brass chandeliers, ivory tablecloths, waitstaff moving like shadows, and the Langleys holding court at the center of it all. Clifton Langley stood near the bar, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who fills a room without any visible effort. He shook my hand with the grip of someone who has never once questioned his own authority. "Dale," he said the way you might name something mildly worth noticing. "Good of you to come." "Wouldn't miss it," I said. And I meant that too, just not the way he took it. Petra was across the room with a cluster of women. She glanced over when we entered, and I watched her eyes travel from Bet's dress to her shoes and back up again. Then she turned to her mother, Vivienne, and said something I couldn't catch, but Vivienne's small laugh told me all I needed to know. Bet heard it too. Her chin lifted just slightly the way it does when she has decided not to hand someone the reaction they're after. We were shown to our seats at the far end of the table. Not the worst seats in the room, but not far off. I pulled out Bet's chair, sat down and spread my napkin across my lap. That was when I noticed Clifton looking at Bet. Not the way a man looks at a woman, nothing like that. Something else entirely. A flicker of recognition maybe, or confusion like a word sitting right at the edge of his tongue that he couldn't quite pull forward. It lasted only a second before his gaze moved on. I filed it away and kept my expression still. Dinner arrived, the food was rich, and the talk stayed shallow, the way it does when people are putting on a performance rather than having a conversation. Clifton told a story about a golf trip. Vivienne described the renovation on their lake house. Garrett laughed at everything they said, a laugh I barely knew anymore. Then Clifton set his fork down, looked across the table at me, and said, "So Dale, how long have you been at the factory?" 38 years, I said. He nodded slowly, then glanced at the couple beside him, with a measured little smile. 38 years, same factory, same town. Some people just know where they're comfortable. The table shifted. I felt Bet go still beside me. I set my own fork down. I looked at Clifton Langley, really looked at him, and I said what I had come there to say. Not loudly, not angrily, plainly enough that there was simply no room left to misread it. His smile held, but something behind his eyes moved. Garrett's jaw tightened next to me. Across the table, Addie pressed her lips together. Clifton reached for his wine glass. "Charming," he said. I reached for mine. I said. The evening was only getting started. What happened next, I had been waiting on in one way or another for 3 months. But before I tell you the rest of that night, I need to take you somewhere else. Because if you don't understand where I come from, where Bet and I sank every root we have, what took place in that ballroom won't carry half the weight it should. Crestwood Hollow isn't much to look at if you roll through it without slowing down. Small houses, old trees, a narrow road that bends toward the water. But Crestwood Creek runs along the back edge of that neighborhood year-round, clear and cold. That creek has fed this community in ways no developer's spreadsheet has ever been able to measure. My father taught me to fish in that creek when I was 6 years old. He had hands like 2 catcher's mitts and a voice like gravel, and he never wasted a word. He'd hand me a rod point at the water and say, "Pay attention, Dale. The fish don't come to the ones who make noise." I have been paying attention ever since. My father is buried in the far corner of that neighborhood, beneath an oak tree that was already old when he was born. The cemetery there is not an official one. No iron gate, no stone pillars. Just a stretch of quiet ground where working families laid their own to rest when they could not afford the county cemetery's fees. Handmade markers, mostly some nothing more than river stones with initials scratched into the surface. My father's stone reads Ned Corbin. He showed up. I carved those words myself. Hank Waverly, who has lived 3 houses down from us for 40 years, once told me that cemetery held more honest men than any church in Indianapolis. I believe him. The garden runs along the creek bank, a long strip of dark, rich soil that the neighborhood families have worked together for over 50 years. Every family gets their section. Bette has always planted sunflowers along the east edge, tomatoes in the middle, and green beans near the water. In summer, that garden feeds half the street. On Saturday mornings, we load up the truck and sell what we can at the farmer's market downtown. That money has gone towards school supplies, car repairs, heating bills. It is not charity. It is community. There is a difference, and people like Clifton Langley have never grasped it. The well at the north end of the garden is stone hand-dug, older than anyone still living. I rebuilt the pulley system on it 15 years ago. New rope, new hardware, same bucket. The water tastes like cold iron, and something I have never found the right word for. It is the best water I have ever drunk in my life. I grew up poor in that neighborhood, not suffering poor, careful poor, the kind where you know exactly how much bread is left, and you cut your slices to match. My father had enough to send one of his boys to a proper 4-year college, and he sat us both down to say so. My brother Warren was 2 years older, sharper in school, already set on engineering. I told my father to send Warren. I said I would work the rest out on my own. He looked at me a long time before he spoke. "You sure, Dale?" I told him I was sure. I taught myself to read better from library books. I learned math from the factory floor. I don't say any of this for sympathy. I say it so you know what kind of man built that family and what kind of house Garrett Corbin grew up in. Bette grew up 2 streets over. I met her at a church potluck when I was 22 and she was 20. She brought a peach cobbler and I ate 3 pieces and told her it was the finest thing I had ever tasted. She told me I had peach filling on my chin. I married her 8 months later. I had no money for a proper ring, just copper wire, a pair of pliers, and about 4 hours on a Sunday afternoon. I bent that wire into a circle, filed the edges down as smooth as I could manage, and dropped to one knee along the bank of Crestwood Creek as the sun went down. Bet put her hand out without a word of hesitation. She wore that copper band 4 or 5 years, right up until I had scraped together enough to replace it with gold. The copper ring lives in a small wooden box on her nightstand. 41 years it has sat in that same spot. Addie came into the world in our house on a February night, snow falling so thick and fast, We had no chance of reaching the hospital. The midwife from 2 streets over pushed through that storm, joined by 3 neighbors who kept water boiling and the lights burning. My own hands were shaking from cold and terror, and something I only later understood was the deepest love I have ever been capable of feeling. Addie grew up with that birth story in her bones, and I have always believed it is part of what made her the kind of woman who does not back down when something is worth fighting for. That neighborhood, that creek, that ground, they did not merely give us an address. They built who we are. And now, I was standing inside a ballroom with brass chandeliers and a man whose hands had never seen real work being told that I was comfortable where I was, as if comfort were a failing, something a man ought to be ashamed of. I could feel something drawing near. Not hear it, feel it, the way a shift in atmosphere announces itself on the factory floor before anything visible changes. A pressure building? I knew it was coming, and I had not shown up unprepared. Everybody who knows us eventually gets around to asking when Garrett turned into someone else. I have chewed on that question through more sleepless nights than I care to number. 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, the porch coffee gone stone cold in my hand. The same stretch of highway I have driven to work so many hundreds of times it passes without registering. My honest answer every time, it was not a single moment. What happened to Garrett was more like watching a creek go dry in a long summer drought. No single morning you can point to. Just a gradual disappearing until one day you look and the water is simply gone. Hank Waverly has been our neighbor for 40 years, 3 houses down, same as always. He is 71 now, slowed down since his hip got replaced, but his mind is still sharp as a tack. Every couple of months, he would catch me out in the garden, lean over the fence and say something like, "How's that son of yours, holding up Dale Garrett, still out there making things happen?" I would give him a smile and say, "You know how Garrett is, Hank never sits still." Hank would take that as an answer. It wasn't one, but I could not bring myself to hand him the truth, because the truth was hard. Garrett's last unprompted birthday call to his mother had been 3 years prior. The last time he had brought up the garden, the creek, Hank, anything about this neighborhood, I genuinely could not place it. At some point he had stopped referring to Crestwood Hollow as home, and started calling it where his folks live, as though that rewording cost him nothing. As though putting mileage between yourself and the place that raised you was a mark of progress. But I owe you a fuller picture of who Garrett was before any of that drift set in. Telling you only what he became would not be honest, and it would not be fair to the boy I spent the better part of my life raising. At 6 years old, Garrett was out of bed before me every Saturday morning without fail. I would come downstairs to find him already stationed on the back porch in his pajamas, fishing rod in hand, ready to head for the creek. The boy still couldn't tie his shoes, but somewhere along the way, he had worked out how to rig a hook all on his own. I never showed him that. He studied it himself, the way children do when they are paying genuine attention. Every week he would carry Opal Pruitt's groceries home, and he did it without being asked, not once. Mrs. Pruitt had been on her own since her husband died. Her knees were bad, and her pride was worse. Asking for help was not something she was built to do. But Garrett understood on his own that Thursday afternoons were when she came home from the store, and he was there. He had just turned 9 when he started showing up. 9 years old. Bet used to credit me for that instinct in him. I always thought it came straight from her. Every year on Garrett's birthday, Bet planted sunflowers along the east edge of the garden. She never explained why. She just did it the way she did most of the things that mattered most, quietly, without making a production of it. Last spring, Garrett came back for a weekend with Petra, and he walked right past that row of sunflowers like they were not there. Petra glanced at them and said something to him I could not make out from where I stood. Garrett laughed, and Bet, on her knees in the dirt not 10 feet away, working at the bean plants, never lifted her head, did not say a syllable. I was watching from behind the screen door, and my chest felt like a wrench had been cranked one full turn too many, around something that was not meant to be tightened. That night, once Garrett and Petra had turned in, I was at the kitchen table when Addie pulled out the opposite chair and sat down. She had arrived that afternoon, and I had seen her tracking Garrett with her eyes all day long. The way a person watches a sky they have reason not to trust. "Dad," she said, "how long has this been going on?" "A while," I told her. "You're not sleeping, are you?" It wasn't a question. She was reading my face the way her mother does, finding whatever I was making an effort to conceal. "I sleep fine," I said. She reached into her bag and placed something on the table between us. A pharmacy receipt, my name across the top, blood pressure medication, beta blockers. She had pulled it from my coat pocket when she went to hang it up. "Hey, Dad," the word split coming out of her. "Addie," I laid my hand on top of hers. "It's under control. You need to tell Mom. Your mother is carrying enough already. She would want to know, Dad." "I'm well aware," I said. "That's the reason I haven't said anything." Addie pressed her mouth into a hard line. Her eyes went wet, and she blinked against it, fighting to hold steady. Then she looked straight at me. "You cannot keep standing between everyone and every hard thing. You are 63 years old, and you are running on empty." I looked back at this daughter of mine, the one I had brought into the world with my own trembling hands on a winter night, while the snow piled up outside, and felt the particular unfairness of how completely she had inherited Bet's gift for seeing past whatever I put up. "I have a plan," I said. "Give me a little more time." She dried her eyes with the back of her hand and gave a slow nod. Not convinced, but trusting me. That is what she has always done. When she went to bed, I crossed to my desk and pulled open the bottom drawer. Buried beneath old tax returns was an envelope with Garrett's name on the front, written there 3 years ago in my own hand. The letter folded inside ran 4 pages and covered everything I had never managed to say to him face to face. Bette had read it the night I finished it and told me not to mail it. "Not yet," she'd said. "Give him more room." I shut the drawer. I had given him room. But what I had stumbled across 2 weeks earlier was telling me that the clock was moving faster than any of us had reckoned with. It was a Tuesday toward the end of May, I remember, because I had just come off an early shift, knuckles still smudged with grease, and Hank Waverly was coming up my driveway with a sheet of paper held out in front of him like it had done him a personal wrong. "Dale," he said, "you seen this before?" It was a letter from a company called Langley Development, addressed to every household in Crestwood Hollow. The subject was a proposed acquisition of properties running along Crestwood Creek contingent on environmental and land use review. Polished language, official sounding, exactly the sort of wording constructed to fill a page while leaving the reader with nothing solid to hold on to. "Hank," I said, keeping the level in my voice. "Who gave you this?" "My grandson pulled it from the mailbox this morning. His wife received one. Sounds like half the block did." Hank's jaw was set hard. "Dale, my father is in that cemetery. His father before him. Now, somebody tell me, what does acquisition actually mean?" "It means someone wants to buy," I said, "or has convinced themselves they can." I carried that letter inside, sat at the kitchen table, and went through it 3 times, start to finish. Langley Development. That name pressed into my chest and just stayed there heavy and cold, like something swallowed wrong. I had seen those same clean silver letters on white before, on the backdrop at the Allerton Hall the night of the engagement party. The very company my son was preparing to marry into. I opened my laptop and started working through public records. Indiana gives residents access to property transaction filings through the county auditor's site, and I had figured out that system 2 years back when a lot nearby changed hands. What turned up over the following 3 hours settled into my gut like ice water. Langley Development had been quietly absorbing parcels around Crestwood Hollow for 18 months. Corner lots, vacant parcels along the creek, 2 commercial properties on the eastern edge. They were assembling a land package one piece at a time, the way you construct a trap one wall, then the next. And then I found the name. It was buried in a disclosure filing for a consulting arrangement, a third-party community liaison, listed as having provided local access and information to support the assessment process. The name was Garrett R. Corbin, my son. I pushed back from that chair and sat there without moving for a long stretch. The refrigerator hummed. A car rolled past outside. Bette was at work. The house had gone so quiet I could hear the clock above the stove. Garrett had not been recruited into this. Nobody had pressured him. The filing showed a consulting agreement he had initiated himself 8 months before I ever saw that letter. He had reached out to Langley Development's acquisitions team on his own. He had handed them neighborhood surveys, access logs, detailed documentation of the creek and garden boundaries. He gave them the full picture they needed to make their case for acquisition. What he got in return was an outlined equity stake in the finished development. He had walked through our garden, stood at my father's grave, sat at our kitchen table and eaten our food, then gone home and sent them the blueprints. I found myself thinking about the last time Garrett and I had gone to the creek together. I had asked him, and he had shown up 20 minutes late, phone already in his hand. We sat on the bank for an hour, and he said almost nothing. When we were leaving, I told him the creek was worth fighting for. He told me I was overthinking it. He was not thinking nearly enough. I closed the laptop and went outside. Bette's sunflowers were standing tall and gold along the east fence, every one of them put in the ground on Garrett's birthday. I stood in that yard and looked at them until my eyes burned. Close to an hour passed before I went back inside. When Bet came home that evening, I was on the porch. She took one look at my face and said, "Dale, what's wrong?" "Nothing," I said. "Long day." She settled into the chair beside me and laid her hand on my arm. "You're a terrible liar," she said. "I know," I said. "Always have been." She leaned her head against my shoulder, and we sat there together while the sun dropped below the line of the creek. I had 3 months before that engagement party, 3 months to decide what kind of man I intended to be and what I was going to do about my son. A younger Dale Corbin would have driven straight to Garrett's apartment that Tuesday night, knocked on his door, and spread every document across his kitchen counter. "Explain this to me. I know that man. I was him for the better part of 30 years. But I was 63 now, and I had learned slowly the hard way, the way every lesson worth keeping gets learned, that the loudest move is almost never the most powerful one. So, I did not call Garrett. I did not call Bet. I sat on that porch until the stars were out, then went inside and made a list. The first call I made the following morning was to a woman named Constance Mabry, an attorney in Indianapolis, who focused on historic preservation law. I had come across her name 3 weeks earlier, while looking into the Indiana Historic Preservation Office, which keeps a registry of sites eligible for state and federal protection. Constance had worked 2 cases involving informal cemeteries in rural Indiana, exactly what we had in Crestwood Hollow. I laid out what we were sitting on: a cemetery dating to the 1930s, hand-marked graves, uninterrupted community maintenance for more than 80 years, a creek and garden with documented communal use stretching back over 5 decades. "Mr. Corbin," she said, "if everything you're describing holds up, you have a solid foundation for a preservation nomination. It won't be quick. The review process runs several months. But filing the nomination triggers an automatic stay on any demolition or significant alteration of the site while that review is underway. How long does it take to put the nomination together? Done thoroughly, 6 to 8 weeks. Less if you have photographs, records, first-hand accounts." "I have all of that," I said. The next 6 weeks I spent working alongside Constance after my shifts ended. Hank Waverly pulled out shoeboxes of photographs going back to the 1950s. 3 other families turned up deeds, church records, hand-drawn maps. I wrote out my own account of the cemetery by hand, documenting every grave marker I had ever been able to read, every name I could attach to that ground: Ned Corbin, my father; Opal Pruitt, our neighbor; 14 others I knew by name, and a row of small stones in the far corner marking children names, long since faded, that we had always tended regardless. The second thing I did was call Garrett, not to confront him, just to see if he wanted to go fishing. He said yes, which surprised me. He showed up 20 minutes late, which did not. We sat on the bank of Crestwood Creek on a Saturday morning in June, and I watched my son give the water far less attention than his phone. After about an hour, I set my rod down and said, "Garrett, you see that bend in the creek where the current slows?" He glanced up. "Yeah." "Your grandfather taught me to fish that spot," I said. "The slow water is where things settle, where things stay." I let a beat pass. "Don't let anybody take away the place that made you son. Whatever it costs to hold on to it, it's worth it." Garrett looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "You worry too much, Dad." He reeled in and went back to his phone. I picked my rod back up. We did not have much to say to each other after that. The third thing I did was drive Bet to her renal follow-up at Indiana University Health Methodist on a Thursday afternoon in late June. She had been going every 3 months for years. I always took her, always waited in the lobby with bad coffee and a magazine I never got past the first few pages of. That day was no different until the door opened. The physician who came into the hallway was not Bet's regular doctor. He was older, mid-60s, silver haircut, close the kind of posture that decades spent in operating rooms puts into a man. He was talking to a nurse, and when he turned, he nearly walked straight into Bet coming out of the exam room. He stopped. He looked at her. Not the way someone looks at a stranger they nearly collided with. Something else, a stillness, a recognition that did not quite add up. His gaze dropped for just a fraction of a second to where her collar ended, where the scar line would start beneath her blouse. Bet said, "Oh, excuse me," and moved aside. The man said, "Of course, excuse me." But he did not move right away. He stood there another half second, then looked back up at her face with an expression I could not put a name to. I was already on my feet across the waiting room. I watched all of it. He recovered, gave a polite nod, and moved on. I noted the name on the placard outside the consultation room. He entered Dr. Howard Crane. On the drive home, I asked Bet if she recognized him. "Never seen him before," she said. "Why?" "No reason," I said. "Just curious." That evening, I looked him up. Dr. Howard Crane, retired chief of transplant surgery at Indiana University Health Methodist, currently consulting part-time, listed in 3 separate charity gala programs over the past decade as a guest of Clifton Langley. I leaned back and felt something move in my chest. Not dread exactly, more like that particular moment just before a storm arrives, when the air goes heavy and still and everything sharpens. I reached for the phone and called the number for Dr. Crane's office. Meanwhile, while I had been building my case from the outside, and someone else in this family had been doing her own work entirely, and she had started 6 months before I ever laid eyes on that surveying letter. Addie has worked as a legal assistant at Witten & Cole, a mid-sized civil law firm in downtown Indianapolis, for 4 years. She handles property filings, contract reviews, public records requests. She is good at her job, the way quiet people often are, methodical, thorough, impossible to rattle. Her supervisor once told her she had the sharpest instincts for spotting a buried clause of anyone he had ever trained. I believe it. She gets that from her mother. It started, she told me later, with a phone call she was never meant to hear. 6 months before the engagement party, Garrett had come home for a long weekend. He and Petra were staying in the guest room, and on Saturday morning, Addie had gotten up early to make coffee. She was in the kitchen when she picked up the sound of Garrett's voice in the hallway. Low and deliberate, the kind of voice a person uses when they do not want to be overheard. She caught 3 words before he turned the corner and spotted her Crestwood Creek assessment. She gave no sign that she had heard a thing. She handed him a mug, asked how the drive had been, and they talked about nothing in particular. But the phrase lodged in her mind all weekend the way a splinter does when you cannot get at it. First thing Monday, she ran Langley Development through her firm's property database. What she found made her grip the edge of her desk. "Dad," she told me later, her voice wound tight with something between fury and heartbreak. They had been acquiring parcels around us for over a year, corner lots, creek-adjacent land, commercial properties along the east side, and in the community liaison section of their acquisition file, Garrett's name with a contract date 8 months before I ever came across it. She spent the next 6 months building her file the way anything worth building gets built, carefully, without cutting corners. She submitted public records requests through her firm under standard discovery protocol. She traced the consulting agreement, documented each of Garrett's access visits to the neighborhood, identified the surveyors he had walked onto the property. She found photographs Garrett had sent directly to Langley Development's acquisitions team, aerial shots of the creek boundary, close-ups of the garden layout, and a photograph of the cemetery entrance that turned her stomach when she saw it. "He photographed Pop's grave, Dad." Her voice broke on that sentence. She pressed her fingers to her lips for a moment before she could go on. "He went back there and took a picture of it and sent it to them." I didn't speak for a moment. I was looking at the image she had printed out, my father's stone, Ned Corbin hand-carved letters, the old oak spreading wide above it, and there in the corner of the frame, Garrett's shadow. "There's more," Addie said. She pulled out another document. He had signed his name on a form authorizing Langley Development to represent his interest as a community stakeholder in any rezoning application. "Dad, that's a legally meaningless document because he doesn't own the land. But it shows intent. It shows he understood exactly what they had planned and made a deliberate choice to help them." "Does it show he forged my signature?" I asked. Addie's jaw went tight. "Yes, on 2 separate filings. I had a handwriting comparison done. My colleague handles forensic document work. It's not close, Dad. It's not even a passable forgery." I looked across the table at my daughter. 26 years old, born in a snowstorm in our own living room, raised in the same house as her brother, pulling catfish out of Crestwood Creek. She had spent 6 months quietly dismantling her family's worst secret in order to put the truth back together. And she had done every bit of it alone because she did not want to frighten me. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" I asked. "Because I needed proof," she said. "Not suspicion, proof. and because I didn't want Mom to find out until we had something we could actually move on. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. I have something we can move on, I said. Are you with me? Addie looked back at me with her mother's eyes steady, clear, not a trace of hesitation. I've been with you this whole time, Dad, she said. You just didn't know it. Now I need to pause here, because to truly understand what happened at that engagement party, to feel the full weight of it, you have to know something about my wife that I did not learn until the night everything came undone. Something she had kept to herself for 32 years. Something that, when I finally heard it, made me feel as though the ground had shifted 2 inches sideways, and I was still trying to find my balance. The year was 1991. Garrett was 2 years old. Addie had not been born yet. We were stretched thin the way young families get stretched, not desperate but deliberate, counting carefully each week. Betta held a part-time job at the hospital gift shop, which is how she got her routine checkups at a discount through the staff wellness program. One afternoon in October, she went in for a standard blood pressure check. On her way out, she passed the nurses' station and caught 2 nurses speaking in that low, tense register that tells you something is wrong. A man had been brought in mid-30s, 2 young children, his wife already in the waiting room in tears. His kidneys had failed. He needed a transplant urgently. His blood type was B negative, one of the rarest combinations for matching. There was no donor on the registry. Betty told me all of this 32 years later. Sitting at our kitchen table the morning after the engagement party, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, she was not drinking. She said she had stood in that hallway and thought about the wife in the waiting room, thought about what it would feel like to sit in that chair and not know. Then she walked to the nurse's station and asked to be tested. She was a match. She did not call me. She did not come home first. She signed the consent forms that same afternoon, was admitted the following morning, and told me she was going in to have an ovarian cyst removed, something her doctor had flagged as a possibility at her last checkup. She had the explanation ready. She had worked it out in advance. She knew that if I learned the truth, I would not allow it, and she had already made her peace with that. The surgery ran 4 hours. The recovery hit harder than the doctors had led her to expect, complications with the remaining kidney fluid, retention blood pressure that refused to settle. She was in the hospital for 4 days, not the overnight stay she had described. She had asked Dr. Crane, the surgeon who performed the operation, not to contact her husband under any circumstances. She told him she had her reasons. He disagreed. He said so directly. But he honored her decision. I learned all of this the morning after the engagement party. I sat across from my wife at that kitchen table and listened to 32 years of truth come out. And I did not say a single word for a very long time, because I did not trust what would leave my mouth if I opened it. Finally, I said, "Betty, I drove you home from that hospital. You could barely walk to the car." "I know," she said. "You told me you were sore from the laparoscopy. I know, Dale. You let me believe that for 32 years. She looked back at me with steady eyes. Not defiant, not sorry, just honest. "You would have stopped me," she said. "And that man had 2 little kids." I pressed both hands flat on the table. My throat was doing something I could not manage. "The money they gave you," I said. "The hospital reimbursement covered my medical costs and what I lost during recovery," she said. "The rest went to Garrett's fall semester." I thought about Garrett's fall semester of 1991. I thought about the envelope Bet had handed me in August, told me she had set it aside from picking up extra shifts. I had been so grateful I never pressed her on it. "The Bet," I said. My voice came out rougher than I had intended. "You gave that man a kidney, and the money you got while you were recovering, you put it toward our son's education." "Our son needed it," she said without flourish. I got up from the table, walked to the window, and looked out at the sunflowers catching the early light in the garden. The ache in my chest had nothing to do with my blood pressure. I stood there until I could draw a breath without it shaking. Then I turned around and said, the only true thing left to say, "You are the bravest person I have ever known." Betty set her mug down. Her eyes finally went wet after everything, after all of it. "I just did what anyone would do," she said. "I know," I told her. "You did what you would do? That is not the same thing at all." Now here is the part of this story that took me the longest to come to terms with. While Bet was lying in a hospital room, recovering under instructions to keep her husband away, a man named Clifton Langley was waking up on the other side of the same building from surgery with a future he had not thought he would have. He was 31 years old. He had a wife named Vivienne and a daughter named Petra, who was 3. The doctors told him the transplant had been successful. They told him the donor had chosen to remain anonymous. They told him he was very lucky. He did not feel lucky. He told me later that receiving that kidney felt like being handed a debt he had no way to repay and no idea how to live with. I'll give him that much. I do. The decades that followed Clifton filled them the way men like him do, growing a company, raising a daughter, showing his face at charity galas and golf tournaments, and the kind of business dinners where deals get made over dessert. What Dr. Crane told me after the engagement party, though, was something else entirely. Twice over those 20 years, Clifton had quietly hired private investigators to locate the person whose kidney was keeping him alive. Neither one found anything. Dr. Crane had guarded those anonymity protocols the way a man guards something sacred, absolute, unyielding, not a crack in the wall. Clifton's response to coming up empty was not to give up and move on. Instead, he created a small private fund. He called it the Anonymous Gift Fund. Every year, it sent money to transplant research and to families who were drowning in medical costs they couldn't meet. Nobody knew about it. It wasn't designed to lower his tax bill. I confirmed that myself later through the public charity filings you can pull up under IRS nonprofit disclosure rules. 22 years of checks, quiet and consistent. When I found that out, I didn't know what to do with it for a long time, because it put a crack in the version of Clifton Langley I had been holding on to for 3 months. The one where he was simply a man trying to strip my family of everything they had built. That version wasn't wrong, it just wasn't the whole picture. Petra had known about the kidney since she was 16. Her father had told her himself one evening after supper, right there at the kitchen table. He'd said he owed his existence to a stranger that no amount of money or effort had turned up. Who that stranger was, that it was the single loose thread in his life he could never pull tight. Petra had taken that in. "That's really sad, Dad," she said. Then she picked up her homework and went back to it. I only know any of this because Clifton told me himself, sitting in my kitchen at 2:00 in the morning, talking for a long time. I'll get to that night when I get to it. What matters here is what Petra never did. She never drew a line between her father's story and the woman who cleaned houses over in Indianapolis. Never connected it to the scar she'd caught a glimpse of once Bet's collar had shifted during a family dinner. 6 months before that, just enough. And then Petra had looked somewhere else, and the thought had never come back. I have tried not to hold that against her. I haven't always managed it. The thing I can't stop returning to is simple. Clifton Langley got 32 years on this earth because my wife couldn't make herself leave a suffering stranger alone in a hospital hallway. He took those 32 years and made something of them. And then he pointed that something directly at the ground where my father lay buried and saw a luxury development waiting to happen. He didn't know. I have to keep saying that to myself. The woman he was maneuvering to push off that land, he had no idea she was the reason he was still breathing. But I knew, and every choice I made from that point forward was going to be shaped by that fact. 2 days before the engagement party, I picked up the phone twice. I've never told anyone about either call, until now. The first one was a Thursday morning. Owen Fitch had a direct line at the Indianapolis Star, and I had it written down. I'd tracked him down after spending 2 months reading his work, 3 pieces on Indianapolis development projects, each one sharper than the last. He covered zoning battles the people shoved aside when neighborhoods got remade, the distance between a developer's promises and what actually got built. His writing had the feel of someone who didn't let things slide, and that quality is rarer than people think. He picked up on the second ring. "Mr. Fitch," I said. "My name is Dale Corbin. I'm out in Crestwood Hollow off Shelby Avenue. I believe I have something you'd want to take a look at." "What kind of something?" The voice was young, but it had an edge of caution to it. Good sign. I told him records documenting an acquisition targeting a historic community along Crestwood Creek, an informal cemetery going back to 1933, a community garden with more than 50 years of continuous use, a creek corridor that had been the lifeblood of that neighborhood across 3 generations, and a consulting arrangement involving a local insider that I suspected his readers would find worth knowing about. Silence on the line. Then, "When can we sit down?" We met that afternoon at a diner on Washington Street. I carried copies with me, not the originals, never the originals of the Langley Development Acquisition filings, the property records I'd pulled from the county auditor's database, and the consulting agreement with Garrett's name on it. I left out Garrett's connection to me. That part could wait. I wanted Owen reading the documents cold without the family angle clouding his judgment. He went through everything without a word for 20 minutes. Then he lifted his eyes and said, "Does this cemetery have any official documentation?" "It will," I said. "Tomorrow morning, I'm submitting a historic preservation nomination to the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission. The Indiana Historic Preservation Office review triggers an automatic stay the moment it's filed. No demolition, no significant ground disturbance. Nothing moves on that site until the review runs its course." Owen's pen moved across his notebook. He looked up again. "How long has the community been using this land without interruption?" "The garden 53 years, the cemetery 90. I've got photographs, church records, and first-hand testimony from 4 families, with roots 3 generations deep in that neighborhood." He gave a slow nod. "Mr. Corbin," he said, "I'd like to be at that engagement party." I had been hoping he'd land there on his own. "I think that can be arranged," I said. I drove back on into my work clothes and put the rest of the afternoon into the preservation nomination alongside Constance Mabry. 6 weeks we'd spent assembling it, 61 pages of documentation, photographs, personal accounts, historical records going back decades. Constance sent it in electronically to the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission at 4:17 the next morning. She phoned me the moment it was through. "The automatic stay is active from the time of this filing," she said. "Langley Development could not touch those parcels, no site, work nothing, while the review was pending." I asked how long the process would run. 90 days at minimum, possibly longer. "That's enough," I said. I printed the confirmation page, folded it into an envelope with a copy of the nomination, summary sealed it, and slid it into the inside breast pocket of my blazer. It lived there until the night of the party. The morning of the engagement party, I was at the bathroom mirror working the buttons on my shirt, when Bet appeared behind me and fixed my collar without a word, same as she's done for 40 years. "You look handsome," she said. I told her I'd looked like a man in his only blazer. She laughed, the kind that gets all the way up to her eyes. "Same thing," she said. Dale, are you nervous?" "No," I told her, and I meant every syllable. She held my gaze in the mirror for a beat longer than usual. "You've got something in the works," she said. "I'm always working on something," I said. "That's the whole reason you said yes." She shook her head slowly, still smiling. She had no idea what that envelope held. She didn't know Owen Fitch's name, or Constance Mabry's, or that I'd put in a call to Dr. Crane's office. As far as she was concerned, we were getting dressed for our son's engagement party, nothing more. I intended to keep it that way, as long as possible. Garrett pulled up outside at 6:30. He put his window down and said, "Dad, please don't embarrass me tonight. These people matter." I stood there looking at my boy through the glass. 30-years-old shirt without a wrinkle, every part of him arranged to make an impression on people who would never see him the way his mother and I did. "I'll be exactly who I am," I said, like always. Now, we are back in that ballroom. Back to the chandeliers scattering light across 300 faces, back to the ivory tablecloths so crisp they looked poured on, back to the Langley family stationed at the heart of the room, as though the deed to the building had their name on it, and for that particular evening, it might as well have. They'd reserved the Allerton Hall's main hall half a year out. They'd made every decision, the food, the flowers, the soft piano music that drifted through the room like something that cost money to feel relaxed about. Garrett moved a step ahead of us, coming through the entrance, nothing dramatic, just enough separation to signal without a word that in this company he preferred a little air between himself and us. I clocked it. Bette did too. Her hand tightened on my arm as we came through those doors, and I caught the small tremor in it that neither of us would ever name out loud. The hall was packed. Indianapolis money, Indianapolis connections. The sort of room where everybody has a rough sense of everybody else's net worth. And the agreement is to never say it, because saying it out loud would be the one truly graceless thing. Women in dresses that cost more than my truck. Men in suits cut to their exact measurements by someone who charges what that kind of precision is worth. And Bet in the green dress she'd ironed herself that afternoon on our kitchen table, the one she'd worn to Garrett's college graduation, and our anniversary dinner at Rathskeller and her sister Claudette's retirement party. She looked beautiful. I don't say that because she's my wife. I say it because it was the plain truth, and because not a single person in that room took notice of her, which told me more about that room than anything else could have. I spotted Owen Fitch near the far wall before we'd made it 10 steps through the door. He was holding a glass of water, dressed like any other guest jacket, but no notepad visible anywhere. He gave me the tiniest nod, the kind that means, I see you, and I'm watching. I gave him nothing in return, not out of rudeness, because eyes were on us, and the last thing I needed was someone drawing a line between Dale Corbin and the young man from the Star, who happened to be standing near the decorative fern. I spotted Dr. Crane over by the bar, deep in conversation with Clifton. The two of them had the ease of men who'd been close long enough to drop all the performance. Dr. Crane had a bourbon going and was mid-laugh at something Clifton had said. He didn't look my way. I hadn't thought he would. We'd spoken once by phone and once briefly in a parking lot, and what existed between us wasn't the kind of thing you acknowledged across a packed ballroom. A young woman with a clipboard showed us to our seats, smiling at everyone with the same steady warmth, which I found genuinely pleasant. The seats themselves communicated something. Tucked at the far end of the main table, not the worst placement in the room, but chosen with intention. Far enough from Clifton and Vivian that entering their conversation would have meant making an obvious reach. Close enough to the kitchen doors that every time a server pushed through them, we heard it. I pulled out Bet's chair. She thanked me the way she always does, softly, like I've done something worth acknowledging. Garrett sat down across from Addie without a glance at either of his parents. Addie caught my eye from across the table and held it for just a second. Her bag hung on the back of her chair, hands resting flat on the table face, composed into the expression of a woman simply attending her brother's engagement party. But her eyes were saying something else altogether. Her eyes said, "I'm ready whenever you are, Dad." I lifted my water glass and took a measured sip and let myself settle. The first hour moved the way that kind of hour always moves in rooms like that one. Food came in courses I couldn't have described afterward. Wine was poured and then poured again. The talk at the table ran in a current that kept looping back toward the Langleys. Clifton held the room with a long story about a golf trip to Pinehurst that involved 3 other men whose names I did not recognize, and a private car waiting on the 18th fairway. Vivian walked through the renovation on their lake house in exhaustive detail, the imported tile, the custom millwork, the architect they had brought in from Chicago. Petra described a trip to Sonoma she and Garrett had taken in September, and the way she told it, Garrett came across less like her future husband, and more like someone who'd been along for the scenery. Not once in that entire first hour did anyone at that table direct a question toward Dale and Bet Corbin. Not where we were from, not how we'd met, not what 38 years of a life looked like, not what we thought about anything at all. Our function was to observe. As far as that table was concerned, we were part of the furniture. Bette ate her food. She asked the server a quiet question about the risotto. Once when Clifton said something that was mostly about how remarkable Clifton was, she touched my hand under the table, and I made a sound low in my throat that might have carried a little further than I intended. She settled me down with a look. She has always had more patience for this sort of thing than I do. She always has. Then Petra glanced down the table at Bette and said in a voice calibrated to reach the 3 nearest tables, without appearing to try, "Bet that's such a fun dress. Did you find it locally?" I need you to understand how she said that word. Locally, the little lift at the end, the way it touched down. Bet smiled. Her smile didn't shift by a hair. "I did," she said. "Found it at a little shop on 5th. I've had it about 4 years. "Oh," Petra said, and turned back to the person beside her, as though that chapter had closed. 4 years. That dress had been to Garrett's college graduation. It had gone to our 35th anniversary dinner at Rathskeller, where the host had recalled our reservation from the year prior and brought Bet a single white rose without being asked. It had been to her sister Claudette's retirement party, where Bet had stood up and given a toast that moved 4 people to tears, the guest of honor among them. She had pressed it herself that afternoon, slowly and with care, the way she does every task that matters. I picked up my fork and kept on eating. Across the table, Addie was watching Petra with an expression I recognized the surface of water just before it rolls into a boil, calm on top, everything moving underneath. Then Clifton set his fork down, eased back in his chair, and looked at me along the length of the table with the unhurried expression of a man who hasn't had to think about a bill in 3 decades. "So, Dale," he said, and my name in his mouth had the weight of something minor he'd just remembered to bring up. 38 years at the same factory. That's consistent. He made that word carry something it pretended not to. I set my fork down. I looked at Clifton. Langley took a real look at him. the silver hair, the well-fitted suit, the settled confidence of a man who had never once in his adult life been seated at the distant end of a table as an afterthought. 38 years, I said. Same factory, same town. You know what that kind of life teaches you. Clifton. He smiled, the smile of a man who extends courtesy to a question he doesn't expect to go anywhere. As what does it teach you? It teaches you what things are actually worth, I said. The land, the work at the people who show up every single day without being told to. And it teaches you pretty quickly to recognize when somebody is reaching for what isn't theirs. The table didn't go quiet in stages. It went all at once like someone had cut the sound. Soft piano music kept drifting down from the ceiling speakers, but nobody at that table was hearing it anymore. Clifton held his smile one beat past the point where a real smile holds. Practiced polish the kind built to signal that nothing has landed. Charming, he said, and reached for his wine. I try, I said. Vivienne was the first to recover, the way certain women at certain tables always are. She pivoted to the couple beside her and picked up a conversation about real estate prices in Broad Ripple, as though the last 30 seconds had simply not occurred, which struck me as an interesting topic to choose, given everything. Garrett fixed his gaze on the centerpiece, an arrangement of cream dahlias and olive branches that probably ran more than Bet's weekly cleaning income, with the concentration of a man who needed something to look at that wasn't his father. Addie pressed her lips together, reached for her water glass, and stayed quiet. I could see what that was costing her. Then Vivian turned back toward our end of the table, wearing a smile that was perfectly correct and landed nowhere near her eyes. Dale, she said, it must be nice. Such a simple life, no complicated decisions, nothing in the way of real pressure, just clock in, clock out. She delivered it the way people deliver things they know are unkind but have chosen to package as casual observation. I set my fork down for the second time. Addie's hand moved toward her water glass and stopped mid-air. Mrs. Langley. I said, in the last 40 years, I've made exactly one uncomplicated decision. I decided to marry Bet. Everything else, every single day of those 38 years, every bill, every call I had to make, everything I did to make sure my family didn't go, without all of it, demanded more thought than most people at this table will ever be asked to give to anything. Vivian blinked. Beside her, Petra's eyes sharpened in a way I recognized immediately. Not offense, calculation. And Garrett looked up from the centerpiece for the first time all evening and held my gaze from across the table with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was somewhere around 16 years old. What I am about to share with you is the part of that evening I had been carrying for months without being able to put it down. The moment when everything that had been kept quiet was going to stop being quiet. Before we get there, if someone you loved had been working against you in secret, would you confront them the moment you found out? Or would you wait and build your case in silence? Something unguarded the faintest shadow of recognition beneath everything else. Clifton cleared his throat and turned to the man on his left with a murmured remark. The table reorganized itself around the moment and moved on the way tables do. I glanced at Bet. She had her eyes on her plate, but the corner of her mouth had shifted just slightly. Just enough. The night had only just begun, and I was finding my footing. Dinner rolled into its second hour. The food kept arriving, and the talk kept filling the room, the way talk does when people are performing, rather than actually speaking loud enough to be heard, shallow enough that nothing real could push through. Clifton and Vivian had absorbed our exchange with the practiced ease of people who have spent decades steering away from discomfort at expensive tables. Clifton launched into a new story this one, about a mixed-use development project in Broad Ripple and the city council members who had pushed back against it early on, and how that resistance had eventually resolved itself. The way these things have a way of resolving themselves when the right people sit down together and have the right conversations. Petra laughed at precisely the correct moments. Garrett refilled his wine glass. I watched Petra the way I have always watched things I don't trust steadily, without letting it show that I was watching. She was skilled in that room. I'll grant her that. She moved through the gaps between courses with the ease of someone raised from childhood to understand that a room is a social instrument and that the people who know how to play it hold an advantage over those who don't. She worked the neighboring tables, touched shoulders, laughed at things that may or may not have deserved it, and came back to her seat each time looking replenished, as though the room were feeding her rather than drawing anything out of her. What she was not skilled at was concealing what she was actually doing. And what she was actually doing, I had been watching it for 45 minutes, was a methodical effort to make sure Bet Corbin had no ease anywhere in that room. It began small enough that each thing could pass for an accident. The water glass at Bet's place went unrefilled when the server made his round, though every other glass at our end of the table was topped off. When a waiter with a bread basket started working his way toward us, Petra caught his eye from across the room and steered him back to her side before he reached Bet. When Bet excused herself after the first course and returned from the restroom, she found that the small purse she'd left on her seat had been moved to the floor beside her chair. Nothing you could hold up in the light and point to. Nothing that announced itself. Just a steady, deliberate stripping away of small dignities one at a time, carried out behind a smile. But I saw it. And Bet saw it. The particular way her spine straightened with each small thing, the way her chin lifted almost imperceptibly each time she absorbed another one, without flinching, told me she had settled something in herself, somewhere in the first 30 minutes of the dinner. She was not going to hand Petra Langley the reaction she was working toward. She was going to sit at that table and eat her food and be exactly the person she was. And she was going to make Petra earn every fraction of whatever she was reaching for. That is my wife. That has always been my wife. Then a server near the middle of the room caught a tray wrong. Several glasses lurched and one very nearly went over. And in the brief pull of attention that followed, heads turning a small collective breath, the server righting the tray with both hands, Petra moved. She turned from the person beside her, lifted her wine glass from the table between two fingers, and came toward our end of the table with the expression of a woman simply crossing her own living room. She stopped next to Bet. She reached past her for a folded napkin on the table, and as she drew her arm back, the glass tilted. Red wine, a full pour Merlot, dark as ink, came down the front of Bet's green dress in one unbroken sheet. Bet pushed her chair back. She rose and looked down at the stains spreading across the fabric she had ironed herself that afternoon, on the dress that had been to her son's graduation and her sister's retirement party and her 35th anniversary dinner. And she pressed her lips together until the color went out of them at the edges. Petra turned to the room. Her hand came up to her mouth. Her eyes widened. "Oh my goodness," she said, pitched to carry to the 4 nearest tables without any appearance of effort. She spilled wine all over herself. She looked at Garrett with an expression of puzzled concern. "Garrett, your mother needs to be more careful around the glasses." The room had turned to look. Something moved through me that I am not going to name here because naming it would require language I don't reach for in polite company. I felt it move through me, and then I let it pass because I had made a decision 3 months ago about how this night was going to unfold, and I was not about to let 30 seconds of manufactured chaos undo 3 months of careful work. But Bet didn't need anything from me, not yet. Her head came up. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, but with something considerably harder and more deliberate. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet and so level that the nearest tables leaned in slightly to catch it. "I didn't spill anything, Petra," she said. "You know that as well as I do." Petra's eyebrows rose. She shaped her face into an expression of wounded disbelief with the speed of someone who has rehearsed it. "Excuse me, are you calling me a liar in front of my family's guests?" "I'm saying what happened," Bete said. "You can call it whatever you like." Petra took one step closer. Her voice dropped. But it was a strategic drop, the kind that pulls attention inward rather than pushing it away. "I would be very careful right now," she said. "You are a guest in this space. You are embarrassing your son and making accusations in front of people whose opinion of this family matters." Garrett was on his feet before I registered that he'd moved. He came around behind his chair and put his hand on my shoulder from behind. I had already started pushing my own chair back. I was halfway to standing when his voice landed at my ear, low, tight, aimed just at me. "Dad, sit down. Please don't make this worse." I turned and looked at my son. He was standing just behind me, one hand on my shoulder, the other in his jacket pocket, jaw set, eyes asking me to stand down to absorb this, the way we had always absorbed things to keep the surface of the evening smooth enough that the room could go on being comfortable with itself. And I saw it fully without any room left for misreading it. What was on Garrett's face was not embarrassment. It wasn't even shame. It was calculation. He wasn't asking me to sit down out of any concern for me or for Bet. He was asking me to sit down because he was worried about himself, about the deal, about the equity stake, about the particular future he had built in his head that required this room to think well of him. I lifted my shoulder slowly and deliberately out from under his hand. "I see you, Garrett," I said just loud enough for him. "I see exactly what's happening here, and I need you to know that." Garrett's jaw went tight enough that I heard his back teeth. He looked away first. I sat down. Not because he'd asked me to, because what I was carrying in the inside pocket of my blazer was going to cause far more damage to the right people than anything I might say in this moment, and I wasn't willing to spend my anger here and dilute it. Petra had already turned back to bed. Her voice had changed register, all warmth now, all concern, honey poured over something with an edge. "Here," she said, "let me help you with that." Her hands moved toward Bet's shoulder, toward the collar of the green dress, her fingers reaching for the fabric. "Let me find you a napkin." I was watching her hands. Bet was watching her hands. Neither of us moved quickly enough. The sound of the fabric tearing went through the room like something snapping that had been under pressure for a very long time. Sharp, definitive, the sound landed and left no exit, no way to pretend it hadn't occurred. 300 people caught it. Not one of them produced a syllable in response. 300 people filling that ballroom, and what descended on the room after was not ordinary quiet. It had mass to it. Nothing like the courteous hush before a toast. This was thick, pressurized stillness, the kind a room falls into when it has just seen something it has no ready frame for. The tear began at Bet's collar, crossed her left shoulder, angled down along her side, the green fabric folding back to show the white of her bra strap, and beneath that, curving along the left side of her rib cage, a scar. Long, pale. That particular silver white you only see on tissue that finished healing 30 years ago and locked in whatever it needed to say and never let it go. It swept in a clean arc below her lower ribs, the mark left by a donor nephrectomy, though the clinical term would have meant nothing to most of the 300 people in that room. What they understood was simpler. Old scar, old story, and Petra Langley had just held it up in front of everyone she'd ever tried to impress. Petra retreated a single step, chin still level, expression still working to hold its arrangement. The wronged party, the helpful one, the woman who'd only reached for a napkin. But her gaze had fallen to that scar, and whatever lived behind her eyes had gone completely, utterly still. I've turned that moment around in my mind more times than I can count. What it must have been like inside Petra Langley's head in the 3 seconds after the fabric gave way. Her father had sat her down at 16 and told her the whole thing. A stranger, a woman, a kidney, 1991. She had absorbed it, said, "That's really sad," and picked her homework back up. 12 years had passed without her turning it over once in any real way. Until now. Until she was looking directly at the scar. I watched the pieces click into place across her face, the connection closing, the math resolving the answer, surfacing like something she hadn't gone looking for and had no way to put back down. Her lips parted slightly. The hand that had just done the tearing fell loose at her side. In those 3 seconds, Petra Langley arrived at an understanding that was going to take her father another 30 seconds to reach. Bet didn't reach for the fabric, didn't try to shield herself. She lifted one hand and let 2 fingers rest against the torn edge lightly, the way a person touches something to make sure it's actually there. Then her hand came back down. She stood where she was in the middle of that room, with the scar out in front of everyone. And I watched her arrive at a choice I had never witnessed in 40 years beside her. Not a choice to push back, not a choice to walk away. The choice to plant her feet exactly where she stood and occupy every inch of the space that was rightfully hers. Her eyes went to Petra. No anger in them, no wound showing. Just the steady gaze of a woman who has kept something private for 32 years and has just been stripped in one abrupt and irreversible moment of the ability to keep it private any longer. "You wanted everyone in this room to see what I am," Bet said, her voice held. It didn't climb or crack. It came out of her the way things come out when a person finally stops deciding how to arrange them. "All right, now they see. I am a woman who has spent her whole working life cleaning houses that belong to other people, and I never asked a single soul to thank me for it. I raised 2 children on what my husband brought home from a factory, and I have never been anything but proud of that." A brief pause. "And I am a woman who has carried a scar on her side since 1991, the year I went into a hospital for a routine visit. And on my way out, overheard a nurse say that a man with 2 young children would not last the week without someone giving him a kidney." She held Petra's gaze. "I asked to be tested that same afternoon. I was a match. I made a decision, and I have not questioned it once in all the time since. Do with that what you will. But that is what I am." Nothing moved in that room. No breath, no shift. Then from the direction of the bar I heard something before I could see who caused it, a glass placed against a hard surface. Not dropped, not fumbled. Set down with intention. The sound of a man freeing up his hands because he's made up his mind. Dr. Howard Crane came forward from the edge of the crowd. 65 years old, silver hair, moving with the measured ease of someone who had spent 4 decades carrying difficult news into high-stakes rooms, and never once fumbling the delivery. He crossed to the center of the floor and stopped, placing himself equidistant between Bet and Clifton, and that placement was not by chance. He turned his eyes to Bet with an expression I had last seen outside a medical building 6 weeks prior. The face of a man who spent a very long time hoping to find someone again, and now that he has, still hasn't fully persuaded himself. It's real. "Mrs. Corbin," he said, "I have spent 32 years hoping I'd find myself in the same room with you one more time." Clifton made a sound. Not words. Words would have required too much composure. Something rose from deep in his chest and escaped before he had any say in it. Bet looked at Dr. Crane. "I know who you are," she said. "I know you do," he said. "And I want to say this plainly. I am not here to speak for you or put words in your mouth. What took place in that operating room is yours to tell or not tell. It has only ever been yours." He kept his eyes steady on her face. "But if you choose to say the rest of it out loud, I will stand right here and back up every word." Bette turned and looked out over the room, past the crowd, past the candlelight, past 300 faces that hadn't moved in what felt like a long time. She found mine. I had exactly one thing I could offer her in that moment. A single nod, slow and certain, made as legible as I could make it. "This belongs to you, Bet. It always has. Whatever you decide to do with it is right." Her shoulders dropped just a fraction, just enough the way they always do when she's finished deliberating, and the effort of it has drained away. She turned to face Clifton Langley. Both his hands were braced against the table. Edge knuckles, drained white eyes locked on her, with the expression of a man confronting something he searched for so long that the reality of finding it doesn't match anything he imagined. "Mr. Langley," Bet said, "in October of 1991, I was at Indiana University Health Methodist for a routine checkup. Walking out, I heard a nurse say there was a man in the transplant ward, 2 small children, wife sitting in the waiting room, who wouldn't survive the week if a kidney didn't come through. I asked to be tested before I left the building." Her eyes didn't move from his. "I was a match. They took me into surgery the following morning." She let that settle, then pitched low enough that only the people closest to her could make out the words she said. "I hope those 32 years were good ones, Mr. Langley." Clifton Langley sat down, not because he decided to. His body decided, and he followed, descending into his chair the way a wall settles when its foundation has just shifted beneath it. Not a collapse, not theatrics. A slow, quiet, unavoidable dropping down. His hand went to his chest. His mouth worked open, then closed, then open once more. "And that was you," he said. The words came out just above silence, broken somewhere in the middle by something that hadn't found a name yet. "All this time, that was you." Addie's hand came across the table and found my arm. She held on so tight I felt it deep in the bone. I didn't stir. I didn't take my eyes off my wife, standing there at the center of that room, scar in plain view, head-up voice, spent the secret she had kept to herself for 32 years, finally belonging to more than just her. I didn't mind the grip on my arm. Not even a little. Clifton Langley sat in that chair with both palms pressed flat against the table, as though he needed the solid surface to tell him where he was. Vivian had her hand on his arm and was repeating his name in a low, urgent murmur, the way you do when you're trying to reach someone who has gone somewhere unreachable. He wasn't hearing her. His eyes were on Bet. Betty hadn't moved a single inch from where she stood, dress-torn scar in plain sight, giving back nothing of the space around her. She was watching Clifton with an expression I had never once seen in 40 years of marriage. Not anger, not satisfaction. Something quieter than either and more lasting. The look of a woman who has finally set down a weight she's been carrying a very long time and is still deciding whether to reach for it again. Dr. Crane stepped forward. His voice carried the same calibrated steadiness it had before, a surgeon's tone trained for rooms where the most dangerous thing is someone losing their composure. "Clifton," he said, "I have known you for 20 years and I need you to hear me. The woman standing in front of you is why you were there for Petra's third birthday. She is why you made it to your daughter's graduation. She is the reason you were present for every single moment that has mattered to you over the last 32 years. He let that breathe for a second. Her name is Bet Corbin. She lives 4 miles from your office. Until tonight, she has been cleaning other people's houses to keep her bills paid. The room held itself still, 300 people making a collective, unspoken decision not to move. Petra made a sound, small, reflexive, barely audible, the kind that surfaces before you can catch it. She was staring at her own hands. Garrett hadn't shifted since Bet began speaking. He was still behind his chair, one hand gripping the back of it, his face the color of ash that has gone cold. His mouth was open just slightly, like a sentence had started somewhere inside him and then stalled out. That was when Addie rose to her feet. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She reached into her bag, drew out a brown envelope, and placed it on the table in front of Garrett, the sound it made landing harder than it had any right to. Over near the far wall, I caught a movement. Owen Fitch had put down his water glass and opened a small notebook. He was writing. I looked away before anyone could catch me looking. Since we're all in the business of learning things tonight, Addie said, her eyes holding steady on her brother. I figured this was as good a moment as any for a few more. Garrett looked at the envelope. He didn't reach for it. Open it, Addie said, not a request. Garrett's fingers moved to the flap. He drew out the first page, a copy of the Langley Development acquisition, filing with his name in the Community Liaison section. Then the consulting agreement, his signature across the bottom. Then 2 pages from a forensic handwriting analysis, placing his handwriting against signatures on 2 county filings, signatures entered there under Dale Corbin's name. Garrett's hands began to shake. The papers rustled faintly and he pressed them flat to stop it. Garrett, Addie said, do you want to explain to Mom and Dad what those are, or should I? Garrett looked up at Bet. His eyes were red and filling fast. His mouth opened and what came through was, Mom, I didn't know about the kidney. I swear to God I didn't know. Betty held her son's gaze for a long moment. I believe you, she said gently. But Garrett, you knew about the land. Garrett's face came apart. I thought, he stopped, tried again. I thought it was just a business deal. I thought it wouldn't. You thought it wouldn't. What? Addie said, and her voice had a sharpness to it I hadn't heard before. You thought Grandpa's grave wouldn't matter. You thought the garden where Mom plants sunflowers for your birthday every year wouldn't matter. Garrett pressed the back of his hand hard against his mouth. He was crying now, fully not trying to hold it back. I got to my feet. I reached into the breast pocket of my blazer and pulled out the envelope Constance Mabry had prepared. I carried it to Clifton Langley's end of the table and set it down flat in front of him on the ivory tablecloth. Clifton. I said, this is the Historic Preservation nomination for Crestwood Hollow submitted to the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission this morning at 4:17. The cemetery, the creek corridor, the community garden, all of it is under automatic stay, pending the outcome of the review. Under Indiana preservation law, no demolition or significant site alteration can move forward while that review is active. I kept my voice even. Your project is finished. I'm sorry you're learning that here tonight. Clifton looked at the envelope. Then he looked up at me. His face was carrying several things at once, none of which I had anticipated seeing on a man like him. I didn't know, he said, about her, about any of it. I know you didn't, I said. That's the only reason you're hearing this from me now, instead of from your lawyers Monday morning. Clifton reached for the envelope slowly, the way you reach for something you're not sure will hold together. He took it in both hands and didn't open it. Vivian began to say something. Vivienne, he said, and his voice had gone rough and low. Please, not right now. I turned back toward my seat. Petra was standing a few feet away, and as I moved past her, she said nothing, but the look she gave me was one I hadn't seen on her before. Not apology, not quite. Something that comes just before apology and costs considerably more to feel. A kind of recognition. I gave her a single nod and walked back to bed. I had spent 63 years learning the difference between what deserves to be said and what deserves to be swallowed. That night, I was finished swallowing. I stood next to Bette and looked at my son, still seated, still holding those papers flat against the table, with both trembling hands, still searching the room for something solid to hold on to. The guests around us had rearranged themselves, some drawing back, some drifting closer, the way people position themselves around something they sense matters and don't want to miss. I was aware of Owen Fitch near the wall. I was aware of Dr. Crane standing quietly off to one side. I was aware of Clifton Langley still holding that envelope in both hands. But mostly, I was aware of Garrett. I walked to where he sat and spoke in a voice I didn't bother to lower. I want everyone in this room to hear what I'm about to say. Not because I want an audience, because the people here tonight have spent this evening forming a picture of this family based on less than the full story, and they deserve to hear the rest. Garrett looked up at me, eyes swollen, face wet, and in that moment, he looked about 12 years old, and pressing forward cost me more than I am willing to put into words. "This is my son," I said. "I love him. I have loved him from before the day he was born, and I will love him through everything that happened tonight and every night that comes after it. That is not in question, a beat. What is in question is this, Garrett. You found out that Langley Development was targeting Crestwood Hollow, and instead of coming to your mother, you signed your name on a consulting agreement and handed them what they needed to know about that neighborhood. You walked into the garden where your mother has put sunflowers in the ground for your birthday every single year, and you photographed it and sent those images to a development company. You walked to the back corner of that property and photographed your grandfather's grave, and sent that too. Garrett made a sound I won't try to describe. You also forged my signature on 2 county filings. Addie found that. She has been sitting on it for 6 months because she didn't want to break your mother's heart before she had something she could actually do about it. I felt Bet draw a breath at my side. She hadn't known about the signature. Her hand found my arm. "I am not saying this to destroy you," I said. "I'm saying it because you are 30 years old and you are standing in a room full of people who are about to leave here with a version of who you are. You need to decide tonight whether that is the version you want to be, not for them, for yourself." Garrett's chin was shaking. "Dad, let me finish," I said. "Your mother gave a piece of her own body to save a man she had never spoken a word to. She did it without telling me, without telling a soul, because she knew that if she said anything, someone would have talked her out of it. She took the money she recovered and used it to pay your tuition. 32 years she kept that to herself, and not once did she come to anyone with her hand out." I held Garrett's gaze. "The woman who brought you up, that is who she is. And I need you to sit with a hard question. Has the man you've turned into earned the right to stand beside her?" Nobody in that room made a sound. Garrett wasn't fighting the tears anymore. They fell where they fell. Betty's hand found my arm. I turned to her. Her fingers went to the collar of her torn dress and worked loose the small chain she had worn every day, the one carrying the copper ring I'd bent from a length of wire 41 years back, kneeling on the bank of Crestwood Creek. She laid it in my open palm and folded my hand shut. I carried it over and placed it on the table directly in front of Garrett. 5 years your mother wore this, I told him. Not for what it was worth, for what the man who made it proved. He came every day. No one had to ask. No one was watching. He came anyway. I moved back a step. "Son, that is the whole of what I have ever required from you. Just show up." Garrett lifted the ring with both hands, cradling it the way a person handles something once they finally grasp what it means. His head dropped forward above it, and his shoulders went with a grief that made almost no sound at all. I looked toward Bet, extended my hand. She took it the instant it was there. 40 years, and that has never once changed. Every time we have walked out of a room together, she has taken it. We were almost to the door when Garrett's voice reached us, fractured barely above a breath. "Mom." Bet's grip on my hand went tight. She kept walking. So did I. There are things a person can find their way back to, and there are things they cannot. Whatever Garrett chose to do from that point, with that ring, with that night, with whatever came next that belonged to him now. Bet and I had carried our part as far as it would go. We headed home in Betty's old Civic 40 minutes, out of the Allerton Hall and through Crestwood Hollow, on streets that had gone to sleep. The way Indianapolis empties out after 10 on a weeknight. Signal lights running their sequences for nobody. Gas stations burning bright over empty lots. A lone car drifting through an intersection here and there, unhurried. For the first dozen minutes, neither of us said a word. Not the strained kind of quiet where things fester under the surface. This was different. The silence of two people who have passed through something weighty and need the space to let it settle before language becomes useful again. We'd shared 40 years. I knew which kind it was. Then Bet said my name, Dale. Yeah. Before tonight, did you already know it was Clifton? My eyes stayed on the road. No, I told her. The land I knew about. Everything else I didn't. I felt her turn toward me without needing to look. You brought Dr. Crane in, she said. I did. How come? Because of the way he watched you in that corridor 6 weeks ago, I said. Whatever was behind that look, whatever he was sitting on, I wanted a man in that room who would tell the truth when it mattered. I had no idea what he knew, but I was certain he wouldn't hide it. Bette went quiet. After a moment, you could have said something to me. You'd have spent every day between then and tonight worrying. Dale, I know. I know you do, Bet. She faced the window again. We went over the bridge that spans Crestwood Creek, and through the windshield, I caught the glint of moving water below Black and Alive. One more mile, and our driveway appeared. The headlights swung across the house front and pulled a row of sunflowers out of the dark along the east fence, tall gold standing there, like they'd been waiting. 9 of them. One for each year Garrett had kept his distance from this place in any real sense. Beside me, Bet made a sound small from somewhere below, words the kind that hovers at the edge of crying, and sometimes that is all it ever becomes. Her hand went up to cover her mouth. A shudder moved through her shoulders once and again, and then the tears arrived, not the kind that asks for anything, not the kind that fills a room, but the quiet and steady kind that tells you a person has finally set something down. I cut the engine, reached over, her fingers wrapped around mine before I'd finished the gesture, firm and immediate, and we stayed like that in the unlit driveway of the house where our family had been built while she worked her way back to solid footing. When she got there, she said, "I'm all right." I said, "I know you are." Inside, I put water on. Bet went and changed, and when she reappeared in the kitchen doorway in her old robe, she looked like the person I recognized again, more so than at any point that evening. We settled at the table with our cups and kept 2 small things. Whether the beds outside needed water, whether Hank Waverly's hip was still giving him grief, whether the sunflowers had another 2 weeks in them before the frost ended it. The everyday kind of talk, the kind that remains after the larger things burn down to nothing. 20 minutes passed, 11 a knock came at the front door. 3 of them, measured not forceful, but nothing hesitant in them either. The knock of a man who'd settled something in himself and was following through. Bet looked at me. I looked at her. I went. Clifton Langley stood on the porch coatless without a tie, his car nowhere to be seen at the curb, which meant he'd come on foot from wherever he'd left it. He had an envelope gripped in both hands, and his face carried the particular look of someone who has been losing an argument with himself for 2 solid hours and only just found a way through it. "I know I have no right to be here," he said. The porch light was old and yellow, and it made everybody look spent. He looked very spent. "No," I said. "You don't." I stepped aside and pushed the door open. "Come in anyway." He took the chair at our kitchen table. Clifton Langley, who had passed 32 years at boardroom tables, engineered to put men on notice now, at a kitchen table on linoleum floors, with a rooster print dish towel hanging from the oven handle. The envelope never left his lap. Bet set a mug of tea in front of him without a word of asking. He thanked her softly, his eyes on the mug rather than on her face, and I could tell the syllables required something of him to produce. He said he'd hired investigators twice, that over the years he had tried to locate her. The hospital gave up nothing. Dr. Crane held that line the whole way. He said he understood why, but understanding it hadn't made it any lighter. He raised his eyes to Bet. After a while, he said he had convinced himself she must be gone, because no other reason made sense. Why else would someone just vanish from his life that completely? Betty held her mug in both hands. "I didn't vanish, Mr. Langley," she said. "I went back to where I belonged." "I know that now," he said. He moved the envelope to the table. "A personal letter is inside, and a bank draft." He said he would understand if she turned both down, but he needed her to be able to choose. "What's the bank draft for?" I asked. He looked straight at me. "For the kidney for her recovery? For every cost the hospital reimbursement never reached 32 years of interest on a debt that has been mine since 1991, with no way until now to settle it." A beat of silence. He said he knew money was the wrong answer, that no answer was the right one, but it was the thing he had to offer. Bet sat with the envelope in front of her for a long stretch. Then her eyes came to mine, and mine went to hers, and we said everything we needed to say without opening our mouths, the way 40 years together teaches you. She extended one hand and let her fingertips rest on the envelope, barely touching it. Then, "Mr. Langley, the land." Clifton sat up straighter. He said he'd called his attorney first thing that morning at 7. The acquisition project for Crestwood Hollow was finished, every active filing withdrawn. He would also fund whatever amount was required for our legal team to carry the Historic Preservation nomination through to completion with the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission. Every dollar it took to lock that property away from this ever happening again. He turned to me. He'd heard we had already filed, said the automatic stay was running. I told him it had been running since yesterday morning. He took that in. Then we see it through the right way, he said. Together if you're willing. I pushed back from the table and went to the counter. Stood there a moment with my back to the room, looking out above the sink at the dark outlines of the sunflowers against the night. Then I came around. One more condition, I said. My father is in that cemetery. 14 other people I can put names to, and some I cannot. That ground is not touched, not managed on paper while something else happens underneath. Left alone, completely. Agreed, Clifton said, and there was no pause before he said it. I settled back into my chair. The morning after the party, I was out in the garden at 6:30 when my phone rang. Constance Mabry, Clifton's attorney, had reached her office at 7 the previous morning to confirm the full withdrawal of all Langley Development acquisition filings against Crestwood Hollow. Constance's voice had the measured calm of an attorney delivering welcome news without letting herself get ahead of it. The stay holds, she said, and with the opposing interest now withdrawn, the nomination review ought to move forward without any meaningful resistance. I'm expecting full approval within 90 days, maybe sooner. The recording, I said, do we still need it? She paused. Given Clifton's voluntary withdrawal and the forensic signature evidence Addie secured, no. The recording is there if we want it. Good to have, but it won't come out. All right, I said. Thank you, Constance. I sat down on the garden bench and held the phone against my leg and looked out at Bet's sunflowers in the early light, 9 of them gold and upright, taking in that first hour of sun the way they always do. The smell of turned earth and creek water drifted over from 50 yards back, and for the first time in 3 months, the tightness that had been sitting in my chest finally let go. The consulting arrangement Garrett had signed with Langley Development included a standard termination clause. Once the primary development project was withdrawn, every associated consulting agreement dissolved with it automatically. Garrett's equity stake, the thing he had given up his family's trust to obtain, was gone the morning after the engagement party, quietly without any negotiation required. A formal termination notice arrived by email. That was the whole of what he walked away with. 3 days after the party, Petra called Garrett. Addie told me about it later. She'd been at his apartment when it came through. She said his phone lit up with Petra's name, and he stared at it a good long moment before he picked up. The call ran 4 minutes. When it was over, he laid the phone face down on the counter and stood looking out his kitchen window and said nothing. Then he said to Addie, "She ended it." Addie said, "I know." Just like that, Garrett said. 4 minutes, Garrett. Addie said it carefully. Not the sharpness she'd had at the party, but the careful voice of someone stepping around, something that might not have cooled all the way. "What did you expect?" Garrett turned from the window. His eyes were dry, which Addie said caught her off guard. "I'm not sure," he said. "I suppose I figured I'd have more time to make things right." "You don't get to fix things in the sequence you want," Addie told him. "Some repairs have to get in line." Garrett looked at her for a beat. Then he said, "Is Dad ever going to pick up when I call?" Addie said, "Give him time." "How much?" "As much as it takes," she said. "You don't get to decide how long, Garrett. That's not yours to determine." A week after the party, Addie went back to Garrett's apartment a second time. The knock was different from the first, not the hard, purposeful one, just a plain knock. Garrett opened the door. He had the look of someone who hadn't slept well or eaten enough. She put an envelope in his hands. "What's this?" he said. "Dad wrote it 3 years ago," she said. "Mom wouldn't let him send it. Read it when you're ready." She left without stepping inside. Garrett called me 4 days after that. I let it go to voicemail. He left a voicemail that lasted 52 seconds, and I sat in the truck and listened to it twice before I went in for my shift. His voice had a steadiness that sounded like something he'd had to build deliberately. He said he hadn't found the right words yet, but that he was going to. He said he was sorry. He said he knew that wasn't sufficient, and he wasn't asking me to act like it was. He said he'd wait however long it took. I kept the voicemail. Didn't call back that day or the one after, but I kept it. 2 weeks after the party on a Thursday evening, Addie rang to tell me Garrett had driven out to Crestwood Hollow. She'd followed him, she said, just wanting to make sure he was okay. He parked on Shelby Avenue and walked to the creek and stood on the bank for a long while. "Did you talk to him?" I asked. "Eventually," she said. "What did he say?" Addie was quiet for a moment. "He said he didn't know how to fix it, Dad." And I told him fixing it wasn't the point. The point was being different today. Not tomorrow, today. She went quiet. Then she said he'd asked whether you would ever forgive him, and I told him I thought Mom already had, because that's the kind of person she is, and that you were going to need more time, and that he should give it to you without pushing. I stood at the kitchen window with the phone in my hand, looking at the shapes of the sunflowers going dark in the evening light. "She's right," I said, "about all of it. I know," Addie said. "She usually is. 2 months is not a long stretch of time. I'm aware of that. 2 months is barely enough for a garden to turn itself over, barely enough for a season to settle into what it means to be. But in those 2 months after the engagement party at the Allerton Hall, something in the air around Crestwood Hollow changed in a way I hadn't felt in years. A releasing of tension like a knot, pulled so tight for so long, you'd stopped remembering it was there. Betty put new seeds in the East Row the second week of September. The summer sunflowers had gone with the first frost, and she spent a Saturday morning on her knees in the dirt, pressing seeds and with her bare hands the way she always does, humming something low and without a real melody, a sound she's been making since before I ever learned her name. I sat on the back porch with my coffee and watched, and I thought, this is what it looks like when someone decides to keep going. No announcement, just quietly on a Saturday morning, hands in the soil. Owen Fitch's piece came out in the Indianapolis Star 3 weeks after the party. Measured, thorough, the kind of reporting that lets the story carry itself without the writer pushing. He covered Langley Development's acquisition strategy, the community garden, the creek corridor, the informal cemetery, and the families who had kept it for 90 years. He did not mention Garrett. He wrote about the historic preservation nomination and quoted Constance Mabry on the automatic stay. He described the anonymous gift fund without naming Clifton, attributing it only to a private donor who had spent 2 decades trying to locate a debt he owed and repay it. 3 families I hadn't spoken to in years reached out after the piece ran. Hank Waverly's grandson had a copy framed and put it up in his kitchen. I sat with that for a while. A newspaper article on somebody's kitchen wall, and what that says about the kind of people who do that. The preservation nomination was approved by the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission on the 91st day after filing. Constance called at 7 in the morning, and the professional evenness in her voice wasn't quite enough to cover the warmth underneath. "It's official," she said. "The cemetery, the creek corridor, the community garden, all designated protected in perpetuity." "Perpetuity," I said. "It means forever, Dale." "I know what it means," I said. "I just needed to hear it one more time." Hank Waverly came by the garden on a Thursday afternoon in October, moving with his cane, wearing the same canvas jacket he's put on every fall for as long as I can place. He posted up at the fence and stood watching Bet work through the spent stalks from the summer plants. "I heard it's official," he said. "The designation." "It is," I said. Hank nodded slowly. He looked out across the garden to the creek, showing through the tree line, at the rear of the property, to the corner where the old oak spread wide over the ground, holding our dead. "Your daddy would have had something to say about all this," he said. "He'd have said plenty." I said he probably would have told us he told us so. Hank said probably. I said he usually had. Hank tapped his cane twice against the fence post, as close as he gets to a real display of feeling. "Good work, Dale," he said. Then he turned and went on his slow way down the street, and I watched until he rounded the corner. On a Tuesday afternoon in mid-October, I carried my rod down to Crestwood Creek and found a spot on the bank by myself. The water was running clear and cold the way it does in autumn, moving across the stones, with that particular sound the creek makes when the level has dropped lighter, more air between the surface and the sky. The oak at the back of the cemetery had turned the deep gold that arrives just before the red sets in, and the leaves were releasing themselves one by one, spinning down to the current and riding it south. I thought about my father, the way he used to set a hook without ever glancing at his hands. What enough years of doing something does to the body, how it becomes a kind of knowing that lives below thought. I thought about Bet in 1991, standing alone in a hospital hallway and making a choice that would alter at minimum 4 lives, probably more, and doing it without telling anyone because she knew someone would try to talk her out of it. I thought about Garrett. Not with anger, I want to say that plainly. The anger had passed through me the way a weather system moves through completely, and then finished leaving things wet behind it, but the sky going clear. What I felt sitting on that bank ran deeper and was harder to name than anger. It was the particular ache that comes from loving someone who has let you down so completely that you have to start over from nothing, figuring out what that love is supposed to look like now. I didn't have that figured out yet. I was still working on it. My phone went off in my shirt pocket. I pulled it out and looked. Garrett. I let it ring through and sat there holding the rod while a yellow leaf broke free from the oak branch overhead and drifted down to the water. It covered maybe 20 feet before the current swept it around the bend, and it was gone. When the voicemail notification came up, I hit play. Garrett's voice said, "Hey Dad, it's me. I know you're probably not ready to talk yet, and that's all right. I'm not calling to pressure you. I just wanted you to know that I read the letter, the one you wrote 3 years ago and never sent." A pause. Wind audible on his end. He was outside. "I've read it 6 times now. I think I'm going to keep reading it until I understand every word of it the way you meant it." Another pause. "I went back to the creek last week. Just sat there for a while. It's a good creek, Dad. I forgot how good it was." His voice frayed slightly at the edges, the way it does when a person is holding themselves together by effort. "I don't have the right words yet, but I'm going to find them. I promise." The message ended. I sat there with the phone resting in my hand and listened to the water and watched another leaf pull loose from the oak and begin its drift downstream. Then I saved the voicemail, put the phone away, and lifted my rod. The creek kept on. It always does, over the same stones around the same bend through this same neighborhood it has been running through since before anyone alive today drew their first breath. My father worked this stretch of water. I have worked it. Addie came into the world 50 yards from this bank on a night when the snow fell so heavily the whole world went white and disappeared. Some things are beyond what money can purchase and beyond what foolishness can undo. Not when the roots have gone down far enough. I cast my line and let myself settle in to wait. I am not someone who speaks much about faith, but I will say it this one time. I believe God places the right people in the right hallways at the right moment. Betty did not walk into that hospital with any intention of saving anybody. She was simply there, and she did not turn away. If you have stayed with me to the end of this one, I am grateful, truly. This story asked a lot of everyone in it, and it asked a lot of the people willing to sit with it. What it cost was years. Years of silence from Bet, years of distance from Garrett, years of a family living around a wound none of them could name out loud. What it taught me is that the people who love you quietly without applause, without asking to be seen, are often carrying more than you will ever fully know. I believe God places those people in our lives not by accident, but on purpose. And sometimes the whole point is that we are meant to finally notice. So here is what I would say to anyone who recognizes something in this story. And I think there are more of you out there than you might expect, whether you are in a family revenge story of your own, or watching one unfold from the outside, whether you are adults, and 50 plus, who have seen what patience and dignity can accomplish, or someone still in the middle of it trying to hold on. Do not mistake silence for weakness. The quietest people in the room are sometimes the ones who have already done the hardest work. Do not trade what is permanent for what is profitable. An equity stake means nothing when the ground beneath it belongs to the people you betrayed. If someone has wronged you, gather your truth carefully before you spend it. And when you find the person who showed up for you, without being asked, without an audience, honor that. If this story moved something in, you leave a comment and tell me what it stirred up. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you are not yet subscribed to Honor Revenge Stories, now is a good time. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one.